I stood back, watching from a distance as my grandparents fished at the lake behind their house. Grandpa focused intently on his fishing rod, waiting for that familiar tug signaling a catch. But Grandma, well, she was different. Her eyes never followed the line or the bobbing lures. Instead, she stared across the water, her head slightly tilted as if something in the dark edge of the woods held her attention. It puzzled me. At first, I figured maybe she just loved the view of the trees, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. That summer, I chose to spend my break at my grandparents' place in Knoxville, Tennessee. They had a cozy two-story house built just a few years back in 2018. The best part was the lake right in their backyard, complete with a dock where Grandpa kept his trusty bass boat. My grandparents were a kind and gentle pair, living a quiet life tucked away from the bustle of the world. Every summer, it became a tradition for me to visit, a routine I looked forward to. Whenever Grandma invited me, it was impossible to say no. Her warm smile and soft voice were like a magnet, pulling me back to their home. There were so many reasons to adore her, with her kindness and generosity being at the top. If I ever wanted something, Grandma usually said yes without hesitation. But what I cherished most were her stories. Grandpa was different. His tales mostly revolved around his time in the military. Thrilling adventures full of courage and excitement. But Grandma had an endless supply of stories to tell. She could spin a tale about anything, a funny moment from her childhood, a touching story about a kind neighbor, or a bedtime story that whisked me away to magical lands. Her words painted such vivid pictures in my mind that it felt like I was right there, living the stories with her. Grandpa, though, was a man of few words. There was a quiet strength about him, and when he did share stories, they were always about his military service. He spoke of the places he had been, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned along the way. While not as fanciful as Grandma's stories, his tales carried a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the life experiences that shaped him. One thing I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He would tell me that most of what he knew came from his military training, often joking that they had prepared him for anything. He was the kind of man you would trust completely if you ever found yourself lost in the wilderness. Grandpa knew everything there was to know about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the right techniques for different fish. Some of my fondest memories were those mornings on his boat, slicing through the cool water, the sun slowly rising, and the gentle hum of the motor lulling us into a peaceful rhythm. Each night, Grandma would dip into her endless reservoir of stories, and I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a vast library with every shelf overflowing with tales waiting to be told. One evening, she might spin a yarn about valiant knights seeking revenge, their swords glinting in the sunlight. Another night, she'd whisk me away to a land filled with magic and cursed territories. Then there were the scary stories. Now Grandma usually avoided those, knowing how they got to me. But the thing about those stories was the level of detail. Man, the detail was something else. They were so vivid, so real, that it felt like I was peering through a tiny crack into another world. A world where the monsters she described truly existed. A world so terrifying that falling through that crack felt like it could be the end of me. We had the same routine every night. I would be snuggled up under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, waiting with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my signal. Grandma, her face etched with the wisdom of countless tales, would step in, a gentle smile on her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, the rhythmic creaking adding to the soothing lullaby of the night. Then, with a voice as warm as a crackling fire, she would begin her story. But one night, as I lay tucked under that familiar patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma to come in. The quiet click of the doorknob let me know she was here. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were like journeys to far-off lands, each story more exciting than the last. But tonight, I felt like hearing something different, something that would send a chill down my spine. "Grandma, can you tell me a scary story tonight?" I blurted out. For a moment, surprise flickered across her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Her stories had always been full of adventure, but she had never ventured into anything truly frightening. She settled down next to me on the quilt, her usual mischievous sparkle replaced by a more serious look. Her eyes drifted to the window for a second before she turned back to me. Then with a gentle smile she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice low and steady. I glanced over at the window where the dark outline of trees stood silently across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice now a soft whisper. A chill ran down my spine, even though the room was warm. Those simple words made me uncomfortable, and part of me wanted to tell Grandma to stop right there. But the truth was, I was hooked. Grandma had told me scary stories before, but they were always make-believe, far removed from anything real. She went on, "Every 7 years, something comes out of those woods. It's a creature that's been around for thousands of years, crawling on all fours. It hunts silently, a predator on the prowl for its next prey." I could feel myself tensing up. The room stayed quiet, but the air seemed to grow heavier. "Its body is human-like, but twisted and distorted," she murmured, "with limbs that stretch out at strange angles, far longer than they should be. Its skin is as black as coal, making it nearly invisible in the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes drifting back to the window. What once felt like a comforting view of the trees now seemed filled with lurking shadows, hiding something unseen. "But the most terrifying thing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "are its eyes. There are many of them, scattered across its head like a spider's. They pierce through the darkness, searching for a victim who does not suspect a thing." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the fear creeping in. "Sometimes, if it struggles to find prey, it will venture closer," she whispered, leaning in. "Closer to houses, looking for an open window." My breath caught in my throat, the thought of those eyes peering through the glass jolting me with terror. "If it finds a way in," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person, dragging them back into the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, but the warmth of the quilt did little to fend off the sudden chill that gripped me. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding on them slowly until the hunger returns. And it needs to hunt again." I gripped the blanket so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin. "But do not worry," she said softly, her voice becoming more gentle. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we will be safe. And remember to do the same when you are at your mom's house." She stood up from the quilt, her smile meant to reassure me, but I could see a hint of unease lingering at the edges. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she walked toward the window. My eyes followed her every step, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. She stared out the window for a moment, as if she were checking to make sure the creature was not lurking nearby. Then she carefully ensured the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, the question that had been stuck in my throat suddenly burst out. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, something unreadable flickering across her face before she managed to give me a reassuring smile. She did not say a word. Instead, she leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture that carried an odd intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered softly. Then with a quiet click, she closed my door behind her. I stayed awake for most of that night, my eyes fixed on the darkened window pane. The once familiar outline of the woods now carried a new, unsettling sense of fear. I kept wondering if those eyes Grandma described, those many eyes, would suddenly appear, staring back at me. Eventually, exhaustion from the fear and lack of sleep overtook me, and my eyelids finally grew heavy as I drifted off. That night, I dreamt of the creature, its form twisting and writhing in the shadows. I was running, my legs moving frantically, but it felt like I was running on ice. Panic gripped me as the creature lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me like a rag doll through the damp grass, the smell of earth and moisture filling my nose. The woods loomed larger and larger as the creature pulled me closer, the jagged branches seeming ready to swallow me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the tree's branches were about to close in around me, I jolted awake, gasping for air. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room was peaceful, the stillness almost calming. It took several deep breaths before my heart finally began to slow. Relief washed over me, pushing away the lingering fear. From that night on, even though Grandma continued to tell her endless stream of stories, the creature she described remained a dark shadow in the back of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through the endless woods, faded away over time. The story slowly slipped from my memory. But a few years later, our family faced a different kind of darkness. Cancer, a relentless and selfish thief, began to steal my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought hard for months, but in the end, the disease took her from us. It left a deep void in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now he lives alone, the silence of the house weighed down by her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain etched into the deep lines on his face. Sometimes he quietly mentions that he is just waiting for his turn to be with her again. It is heartbreaking to see. A once strong man now reduced to a solitary figure, simply waiting for his time to come. That year was a blur, a dark tunnel of grief we all had to find our way through. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. The second floor was an option for escape, but jumping out the window would likely leave me injured and vulnerable. Besides, that is where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door was my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate move, I lunged for it, the rough wood solid in my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all the strength I could muster, landing a blow with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. As the years passed, the grief began to ease, though Grandma's memory stayed with us. Then a few more years later, during my senior year of high school, something unexpected happened. I walked into the house after a long day, greeted by the familiar emptiness. Mom had already left for work. I tossed my backpack onto my bed, pulled out my books, and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and maybe a little TV. I turned off the television, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. But sleep refused to come. My mind was a whirlwind, churning over the events of the day. I glanced at the clock on my desk, its green numbers glowing. It was almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound broke the stillness, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes shot open, darting towards the window. A wave of cold fear washed over me, chilling my blood. Memories of Grandma's story rushed back. The creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a shape that blocked most of the moonlight from coming in. If it weren't for the thin sliver of light creeping around the edges, I might not have seen it at all. The form was vaguely human. Pressed against the window and across its head, I could swear I saw something moving. A flicker, like tiny insects scurrying over its skin. Then the horrifying truth hit me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids fluttering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath caught in my throat. Was this a nightmare? At that moment, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, began to snake toward the base of my window. Did I lock the window? The sickening sound of the glass sliding up reached my ears. Terror gripped me, choking the scream that clawed at my throat. There were woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization settled in. This was not just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, triggering my fight or flight response. I threw myself out of bed in a frantic scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted for the door, yanking it open, only to have it slam shut in my face, the force knocking me backward. A strangled cry escaped as a wave of terror washed over me. My body froze, every muscle locking in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, no longer at the window. It was above me, hovering near the door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand that resembled a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, trapping me inside. Another limb twisted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a nightmarish grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied all human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A multitude of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind desperately searching for any glimmer of hope. The creature recoiled slightly, its many eyes flickering, perhaps in surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, No growl. This thing moved with an eerie quiet. Even as it shifted, it made no sound. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dominating the space in my room. As it drew closer, lowering itself into a predatory crouch, I swung the now mangled bat wildly. The bat connected with a bone-crunching impact, sending splinters flying as the creature recoiled, its grotesque form faltering just long enough for me to seize the moment. I bolted past it, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I raced down the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the space with a warm, reassuring glow. Panting heavily, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline. Its splintered end pointed toward the top of the stairs, where the thing in my room lurked. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense quiet, the creak of the front door opening. I spun around, bat raised, my heart thudding in my chest. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are," my mom's voice laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" Her sentence died on her lips, the words cut short as her eyes widened in horror. But before either of us could react, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out from the darkness, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, its talons sinking deep into her flesh, with a sickening tear that echoed in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then, the scream came, fully formed and filled with terror, as the thing dragged her away, towards the woods. I ran with all my might, my feet pounding the ground, but the creature was too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching helplessly as my mom's screams filled the night. Her arms wrapped around the creature's limb in a desperate attempt to escape. I tripped and fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching itself from my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. My mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, then faded into a horrifying silence as they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I recounted exactly what I saw, but they looked at me like I was insane. What else could I say? For hours I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blinding and disorienting. They questioned me repeatedly, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance, nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to hit a dead end. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they let me go. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. I sit alone in my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. There, clinging to the outside of the glass, is a large handprint, a grotesque, splayed imprint of multiple fingers. A cold realization settles over me, chilling me to the bone. Now I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that at least one of my grandma's stories was real.